Olá, tudo bem? Bem-vindo a mais uma edição do programa Real News 247, em que eu legendo e mostro para vocês reportagens feitas pela emissora norte-americana The Real News, que é uma emissora sem fins lucrativos, com uma reputação progressista. Essa semana eu vou falar sobre a crise na Amazônia. O mundo inteiro está de olho. Tem manifestações acontecendo em frente às embaixadas brasileiras no mundo inteiro. O Brasil virou uma vergonha pelos sinais que o presidente Jair Bolsonaro fez para os ruralistas, que eles podem agir dentro das reservas ambientais e dentro das reservas indígenas, na região amazônica. O Bolsonaro tenta culpar os ONGs, ele começa a falar sobre soberania, que eu acho muito engraçado, que um cara que está vendendo tudo para os Estados Unidos, que está dando tudo para Trump, vai começar a falar sobre soberania. Se o governo Bolsonaro está preocupado de soberania, por que ele está dando base de lançamento do Alcântara para os americanos? Eu sei que tem uma linha histórica da esquerda também que reclama dos ONGs. Certo, tem um fundo de verdade em tudo, né? E tem ONGs muito bons e tem outros muito ruins. Eu não vou dizer que ONG, de uma forma geral, é bom. Eu trabalhei 10 anos no setor de ONGs, mas tem algumas que são boas, né? E tem ONGs ambientalistas que são boas também. Uma coisa que é verdade, eu já trabalhei 10 anos no setor de ONG, eu nunca ouvi falar no mundo inteiro de uma ONG tocando fogo, criando um incêndio florestal. Isso não existe, ok? Não existe, é uma piada. O mundo inteiro está rindo disso. Então, na primeira reportagem é isso. O gerente do Amazon Watch falando sobre a conjuntura. A segunda reportagem que eu vou mostrar é uma entrevista com o jornalista Alexandre Zaitchik, que passou 3 meses esse ano dentro das reservas indígenas na Amazônia e fez uma excelente matéria para o Intercept sobre isso. E falando sobre esse assunto da Amazônia, eu vou viajar lá amanhã de manhã. Vai ser um pouco diferente. Semana que vem não vai ter Real News, vai ter um documentário que eu vou fazer dentro da Amazônia para vocês. Então, espero que vocês gostem do programa de hoje e boa tarde para todos e todas de vocês.
It's the Real News. I'm Dharna Noor. The Amazon rainforest is burning at a record rate. The fires are so big that you can see the smoke from NASA's space satellites. On Monday, the sky turned black over the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and meteorologists found that the smoke filling the sky there was from fires from thousands of kilometers away. Brazil's National Institute for Space Research has documented almost 73,000 forest fires this year already. That's an 84% uptick from what they saw in the same period last year. And this comes amid a spike in deforestation in Brazil under right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro. He took office in January. But on Wednesday, Bolsonaro said that NGOs are to blame for this uptick in fires. Now joining me to talk about this is Christian Poirier, who directs Amazon Watch's Brazil program. Thank you so much for being here today, Christian.
Thanks for having me.
So, of course, a number of factors can contribute to these wildfires. Increased dry periods because of climate change, increased logging. Some fires are even created intentionally to clear land for agribusiness. Talk about all of those factors and why we're seeing this huge spike in fires in the Amazon.
Under President Jair Bolsonaro, who is now in the 8th month of his tenure, we have seen an explosion in deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. Almost all of this deforestation is considered illegal. One report said 95% of deforestation we're seeing today should be considered irregular or illegal. And this is due to the rhetoric of Jair Bolsonaro and indeed his policies, which are entirely anti-environmental and antagonistic to human rights as well, especially to the rights of indigenous peoples who occupy the Amazon, 22% of which is indigenous territories. So the giant spike in deforestation we're seeing today, a 67% spike since last year, and the signals that Bolsonaro is sending to rural actors, farmers, and also illegal actors, militias, and mafias that are operating with wanton impunity under his reign is driving a process of illegal invasions of protected areas like indigenous territories and other protected forests, the intentional setting of fires, the 73 1,000 fires we are seeing today, almost all of these were set intentionally because in Brazil, this is considered the burning season. This is not unusual. What is unusual is the 84% spike since last year. This is a humongous growth in forest fire setting, and the scale of these forest fires are unprecedented. What we see as well is Bolsonaro trying to shift the blame from his own real responsibility for the massive destruction of the Amazon and the attack on indigenous and other traditional peoples who live there, by shifting the blame to nonprofits, NGOs that are doing very good work to try to protect the Amazon and its peoples. This is a pathological denial of the truth that we all are quite aware with, or quite familiar with here in the United States under Donald Trump. Fake news is a motto of these leaders. It's also denial of science. The stats you cited earlier, the 72,843 fires we witnessed today, are from Brazil's Space Research Center, INPE. INPE director was sacked just a couple of weeks ago for telling the truth, for doing his job, for showing that deforestation is on the rise. And Jair Bolsonaro went on record saying that this is fake news, that INPE is trying to smear Brazil's reputation, when in fact it's doing its job. It's doing its job showing Brazilians and showing the world about the environmental catastrophe that is befalling the Amazon today. And what Bolsonaro is doing is he's responding to the calls of Brazil's agribusiness sector, the people who actually brought him to power, to open up protected areas in the Brazilian Amazon to extractive industry and agribusiness and to infrastructure development. He is answering the call of this sector and doing their bidding. Basically, Brazil's agribusiness sector is running the show in Brazil today, alongside mining. And what we see is that these actors who have long sought to open up protected areas, protected forests, indigenous territories to their activities are acting with impunity. They're acting with incredible lawlessness, and they're seeing the complete absence of the state. The government has gutted the ability of the environmental agency, IBAMA, to monitor and enforce environmental law in the Amazon. And the signal that this sends is that these actors can go ahead and set fires to the forest, attack, invade, and terrorize, in fact, even kill indigenous peoples who live there with impunity. So this is of enormous concern. It's not something we witnessed previously. This is very much what Bolsonaro has brought to the table as president.
You've mentioned the impact on the indigenous folks still living in the Amazon. And of course, these fires there have a global impact. But could we talk a little bit about how they're affecting the folks who are actually there? You recently visited the Amazonian state of Pará, where the Munduruku people live, I believe. What do these fires and these policies contribute to them due to these populations? And then what kind of resistance is mounting amongst those populations too?
Well, indigenous peoples are really on the front lines today of the most brutal attack on their rights and on the forest in 30 years. We're seeing the rollback of 30 years of progress on human rights and environmental protections in Brazil today. Indeed, hearkening back to Brazil's military dictatorship, the times that Jair Bolsonaro eulogizes, that he calls back to all the time, and what he'd like to see sort of a regime installed that's doing similar, have a similar agenda of wanton destruction of the forest for so-called environmental progress. And indigenous people, as I mentioned, are suffering the brunt of this attack today. I was recently on the river Tapajós in the state of Pará. Pará is burning today. And I was with the Munduruku people. The Munduruku people have been resisting for centuries the incursions of outsiders, be them the Portuguese, a variety of other actors, including now today the Brazilian state, who want to build dams on their river, who want to allow wanton destruction of their territories by way of logging and mining, and who are absolutely absent in their constitutional duty to title and defend Munduruku territories. Just after I left Munduruku the territory of Saruai-Maibu, the Munduruku carried out what's called an auto-demarcation activity because the state has not demarcated this territory, leaving it open to a variety of threats, acute threats that I witnessed. Diamond and gold mining rampant in the region, polluting waterways, destroying forests, and then we have also illegal loggers acting completely in open impunity. And we see as well the Munduruku needing to resist and defend their territories on their own without any federal support. They went onto their territories and drove illegal loggers off of their land and did so on their own at great peril, because these are armed militias we're seeing them go up against today. The murder of the YAP leader in the northern state of Amapá shows that stakes are rising for indigenous peoples. The Munduruku and others are really on the front lines of these struggles and need to be supported.
Yeah, absolutely. But the stakes are rising for the rest of the world as well. A report from the Brazilian research center Amazônia showed that some 20% of the Amazon was destroyed in the 20th century. And then last month on The Real News, we spoke with Alexander Zaitchik, who found in a report for The Intercept, actually, that if we lose another 20% of the Amazon, and that could happen in less than 30 years, it could trigger what scientists call this dieback loop, where the forest could start to dry out and burn on its own until it was completely obliterated. Of course, the Amazon stores carbon, so it slows global warming. It supplies 20% of the world's oxygen. It's also responsible for 10% of the world's biodiversity. What happens if we lose the Amazon? What happens to the global population if we lose this incredible resource?
The Amazon is indeed approaching what specialist scientists have been calling a tipping point for some time. The moment it crosses that tipping point, it will no longer be able to create its own climate, its own rainfall, and sustain itself as the life-giving rainforest that we all need to act as a buffer against runaway climate change. The Amazon creates weather patterns around the world. It also creates rainfall for Brazil and for Brazil's agribusiness sector. So it's should be seen as an incredible shot in the foot for the sector to be sponsoring the wholesale destruction of the forest today. But if we see the Amazon lost, we will go with it. The Amazon is essential to our survival. It's essential to the stability of our climate. And we all have a responsibility to seeing that it's protected.
And what needs to happen to end this crisis? Who needs to be held accountable? And how do we do that?
Well, first and foremost, we need to hold the Bolsonaro regime accountable for its responsibility in driving this crisis today. But Bolsonaro has cut off ties with all forms of resistance to his government, or even attempts to dialogue with his government, from the social and environmental justice movements in Brazil, including Brazil's national indigenous movement. So what we're seeing is that these movements are taking their struggles to a global level. And they're calling for accountability from international buyers of Brazilian commodities. Brazilian markets are very dependent on export commodities like soy and beef, timber and other commodities that are vulnerable to market pressures and political pressure abroad, especially in Europe, which is the second largest importer of Brazilian commodities. We need to see Europe take a leadership at this critical moment to push back and say it will not be buying commodities from Brazil that are linked to illegal deforestation and rights abuses. We need to see European politicians, the European Parliament, do not ratify the EU-Mercosur trade agreement under these conditions. We need to see that these trade blocs do not allow for open, free trade under these conditions. We need to see much better standards put into supply chain management and the protection of forests and human rights foremost over trade. This needs to be conditions that are installed over any sort of trade regime to protect the Amazon, because this is one language the Bolsonaro government will understand. International boycotts of conflict commodities, the closing of markets. This is the language they'll understand. They're not going to understand the language of dignity, of responsibility, of human rights, of environmental protection, everything we expect from our leaders. They're not going to hear this. So we have a responsibility internationally, in the North, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, to make a stand against this destruction, because it's all of our responsibility. It really implicates all of us.
Okay, well, as you at Amazon Watch continue to mount this, this disruption, to continue to fight this and document the struggles and the fights of indigenous populations in Brazil and elsewhere, we'd love to hear from you again. Christian Poirier, the director of Amazon Watch's Brazil program, thank you so much for being on the Real News Network today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. The policies of Brazil's right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, is placing the Amazon rainforest under extreme threat once again. For a while, from 2004 to 2016, the Amazon's destruction had been slowed and even partially halted. However, ever since Bolsonaro has taken over as president, the rainforest destruction has been accelerating again at a frightening pace. According to Amazon, a Brazilian research center, deforestation in the first months of 2019 increased by more than 50% relative to the same period in 2018. Most of this deforestation took place illegally in protected areas. The Amazon is an ecological system that is essential for the world's climate. 20% of the world's fresh water cycles through its rivers, plants, soils, and air. And about 20% of the rainforest was already destroyed in the course of the 20th century. If another 20% were to be destroyed, which could happen in less than 30 years, it would trigger a vicious feedback loop that scientists call dieback. This is what happens when the forest begins to dry out and burn on its own until it disappears completely. Joining me now to discuss the impact of the Bolsonaro government on the Amazon rainforest is Alexander Zaitchik. He's a freelance journalist who has covered indigenous issues and land conflicts in Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil. His most recent article was published in The Intercept and is titled Rainforest on Fire: On the Front Lines of Bolsonaro's War on the Amazon, Brazil's Forest Communities Fight Against Climate Catastrophe. His investigation and the article were supported by the Pulitzer Center. Thanks for joining us again, Alex.
Good to be here.
So before we get into the policies of the Bolsonaro government, give us a brief overview of how the Brazilian government has dealt with the Amazon rainforest before Bolsonaro became president.
Well, there's really two distinct phases. There is the period up until the transition to civilian rule in the late 1980s. And that entire period, which covers the modern history of Brazil, was basically one of either indifference or extremely aggressive attempts to develop the region and bring, quote unquote, civilization to the rainforest, to settle it, to develop agriculture, to log it, to mine it. And that triggered runaway deforestation that really wasn't brought under control until about 2004, as you mentioned. And beginning in the late 1980s, there were attempts put in place to preserve the rainforest. There was an understanding that was happening not just in Brazil but around the world that climate change was related in a very serious way to deforestation, to the carbon that was released when the forest was burned. And the agencies that are now being dismantled were set up, primarily IBAMA and ICMBio, the conservation agency in Brazil. There were satellite systems put into place, which the Bolsonaro government is now trying to privatize. All of the efforts that resulted in the slowing and eventual stop to the runaway deforestation unleashed in the 70s and 80s basically are now being, all those attempts are being rolled back across the board. It's hard to think of any initiative that Bolsonaro has not gone after. And it's gotten to such a point where even the Norwegians, who have done the yeoman's work of trying to keep momentum going forward in Brazil, are talking about pulling support for the Rainforest Fund, which is $1 billion fund that they and certain other, mostly European countries, started to make sure Brazil was not on its own in dealing with this international crisis, which, as you mentioned, has profound implications for the health of the Earth's biosphere.
Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into this. I mean, as we've had you on before, actually, a couple of months ago, and it was already clear back then that, and also already when Bolsonaro was running for president, that he has complete disdain for the Amazon's protection. Now, in what ways exactly has he fulfilled on his campaign promise to open the Amazon for development?
Well, it begins with signals, very important signals, even during the campaign that he sent to the illegal economic actors that are hiring the chainsaw crews that are now, with the beginning of dry season, beginning to burn the land that they've cleared. And basically those signals were very, very clear that said, will not be from this government. And we're now seeing the fruits of that. Some of the early data that we got in the beginning of winter, which you mentioned, were scary enough. But now we're getting information with regard to the dry season, which is not just 50% up, but 90 and 100%. We're seeing double the rates of recent years. And The satellites, it's worth noting, can't even capture the worst of it because all they can really see is outright deforestation, and they catch the plumes sent up by the burns. But what you find on the ground, and this is why the indigenous communities that I wrote about in that piece are so important, they're sort of like satellites on the ground. What they can tell you about is forest degradation, forest fragmentation, the smaller cuts, which show you the trend lines into the future. They can show you what's happening under the canopy, which is often as important as the outright clearance of the canopy. And the agencies that were put in place to monitor this stuff on the ground alongside the indigenous communities and other traditional forest communities are being defunded, they're being destaffed, they're basically being restricted from doing their jobs. In the most famous instance, in the Mier National Forest, IBAMA agents were told personally by Bolsonaro in a video he released not to destroy, they were prohibited from destroying equipment that was requisitioned in the forest, which is their main deterrent, actually. I mean, the fines they give have always kind of been jokes. Almost none of them are ever paid. But when heavy machinery is destroyed in situ in the forest, that's a serious deterrent because this is quite expensive machinery, regardless of who's funding the operations. And Bolsonaro is actively holding back IBAMA agents from executing the one power they have to actually deter this kind of activity in protected areas. It's like I said, it's across the board. I mean, you can go through any of the agencies and show basically how it's been gutted and how people are being kept back from doing their jobs. FUNAI, the Indian agency, is operating at a drastically reduced capacity. Often you have field stations in the middle of the Amazon with one FUNAI agent who's responsible for a vast territory of escalating social conflict and violence. And the idea that they're going to be able to fulfill their duty to help the indigenous communities monitor and protect their land is, it's not realistic.
Now, the Amazon is known not to be very good for growing crops because the soil is not very fertile. Now, if it's not good for growing crops, what are the material interests behind the Amazon's deforestation?
Well, it's not good for growing crops, but you can grow things in the soil for short periods of time. You can grow forage for cattle, and then through pesticides and more clearing, expand that ranch territory, and you can ranch on that ground, as we've seen over the last 50 years. But it requires constantly expanding to make up for the depleted soil. Same thing with soy. I mean, you can farm in it, but it requires heavily industrial, poisonous methods of farming. And of course, there's logging. There's a lot of trees in the Amazon that are worth a lot of money to the international lumber trade, which, despite a lot of efforts in recent years, is still not close to being one that is monitored or certified in any sort of credible way. The certification regimes that we've seen in the last 20 years are full of holes, and they're very easily gained. So people who think that they can choose, good rare woods and hardwoods out of the world's rainforests are sort of kidding themselves. So obviously there's a lot of economic activity that pays off. The problem is it requires a huge environmental trade-off, and most of it is short-term because, as you mentioned, the soils are not very good. And the reason the rainforest is so abundant with life, and always has been, is because of the canopy, which is constantly falling, degrading, deteriorating, and releasing nutrients into the soil. And when you remove that cycle, these very thin layers of dry soil and clay die very, very quickly.
In my introduction, I already pointed out the Amazon's importance for fresh water. Tell us more about the role that the Amazon plays in the global ecology and what its destruction would mean for that ecology.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate. I mean, the amount of water that flows through the Amazon is estimated to be a fifth or more of the world's supply of fresh water. And that's not just the rivers, the famous Amazon and its 2,000 feet of rivers, but it's also the moisture in the air. It's the rivers that this constant transevaporation that is taking place under the canopy, just above it, the cloud forests. the way that this water is swept up into these massive, conduits in the atmosphere that are responsible for agriculture thousands of miles away. And if the Amazon system begins to break down, then those river systems will begin to dry up, and so will the atmospheric moisture that cycles throughout the world as well. And the implications are profound for our ability to grow food, which is already being obviously put under great amounts of pressure with climate change.
Well, yeah, and actually, one of the things that the Amazon is known for, or is called sometimes, is a carbon sink. It absorbs carbon dioxide. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and also what that would mean if it were actually to burn off the existing carbon that is already basically sequestered currently in the Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant process. Rainforests are always absorbing carbon. They're always releasing a certain amount. It's not just a carbon sink, but it is large enough that it is a net carbon sink, and that is now being reversed with the clear cutting of more of the forest. You have generations worth of carbon that is released, and it's released immediately when these trees are cut or when forest begins to degrade. And again, the degradation is almost as important as the clear cutting, and the degradation is not picked up by the satellites. So you have to take the satellite data with an asterisk, because there's other stuff happening in the forest. And should all of that carbon be released in the form of a sort of rolling systems collapse, like you mentioned in your introduction, it would be the equivalent of, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it would be like 100+ years worth of industrial activity, just a carbon bomb. I mean, it would be the closest thing you could imagine to, a carbon doomsday bomb, on par with the permafrost or other big feedback triggers that people are warning about right now. It's up there with the big stuff.
Now, what needs to happen for the Amazon to be saved? I mean, in terms of, in the policies in Brazil, and what are the indigenous and ecological groups of Brazil doing in that sense?
Well, the first thing most immediately would just be to enforce the laws already in the Brazilian constitution. There are laws regulating how much deforestation can take place in protected areas and non-protected areas. And that foundation should be immediately respected and provide the baseline for further regulation. That is not happening. The agencies that are being gutted should be expanded. They should be empowered to do their jobs. More people should be hired, not fired, which is what's been happening under Bolsonaro. The tribes who are on the front lines of these struggles and provide often the buffer between larger tracts of forest and the so-called economic frontier, they should be assisted to do the work that they've been doing for so long and want to continue doing and are now doing alone. They've been abandoned to monitor these ancestral forests themselves, which is a very dangerous thing to be doing when you don't have state support. And murders have been a big part of the story and unfortunately look set to increase. And that's a risk that they're very bravely willing to take. When I was down there, it's very inspiring to hang out with these people and see how much danger they're in and how much danger they're willing to accept for them and their families to try and protect what they understand to be an international commons. And more broadly than that, I think there's a conversation that's beginning to take place that I think has to deepen and accelerate the sooner the better. And that's the conversation about whether this 8 billion person global economy based on growth and consumption can be massaged into sustainability, which is a very dubious proposition. And I think we need to really start thinking about different frames, different organizing principles for our way of life on this planet.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for now. I'm speaking to Alexander Zajac, freelance journalist and author of the Intercept article, Rainforest on Fire, which I highly recommend for everyone to look at, and we'll link to it with our story. Thanks again, Alex, for having joined us today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Greg.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.